Hey folks, welcome to Deep Dive Dispatch, the podcast where we don't just scratch the surface. We dig deep into the political landscapes that shape our world today. I'm excited to introduce your guides on this journey through history and headlines, John Matthews and his insightful co-host, Sarah Collins. Together, they'll peel back the layers of complex political issues, offering a slightly conservative viewpoint while staying rooted in facts and historical context. So, buckle up for a thought-provoking ride as we dive into the stories behind the stories. This is Deep Dive Dispatch. Let's get started. Hey everyone, just taking a moment to send a huge shout out to all of you tuning in to Deep Dive Dispatch. Your support really keeps us going. And if you're enjoying the deep dives and want to help us continue bringing you these thought-provoking discussions, head over to deepdivedispatch.com. It's an awesome way to support the show and keep the conversation alive. Big thanks for being part of our community. Now, let's jump back into the next part of our episode and keep unraveling these intriguing topics. Enjoy.
All right, so today we're diving deep into liberty.
Yeah, liberty.
Not just as like an idea, but how societies actually try to make it real and protect it.
Yeah.
You know, against tyranny,
Right.
like actually protect it.
And how that's changed over time.
Yeah. We got a whole bunch of sources here. Historical stuff, legal analyses.
Oh, and some,
Oh, yeah, some pretty strong opinions on gun control, too. Should be interesting. Ready to get into it.
definitely. I mean, it's always fascinating to see how people, or I guess societies, have thought about this stuff. Like, for a long time, individual freedom, not really top of mind for those in charge.
No, not at all. Actually, the American Revolution kind of flipped that whole script, didn't it? It wasn't just about, like, taxes or who got to vote.
Right.
Our sources really show that people were just fed up. Like, they were being silenced. Their freedom was just trampled on.
Yeah, you can see that in their writings, a real sense of enough is enough.
And they were ready to fight for something better.
Yeah. I mean, it was radical for the time. The revolution was basically saying individuals should have a say in how they're governed, consent, not coercion.
And it wasn't just talk either. They put their lives on the line for that.
Yeah.
No wonder it's called, what is it, the shot heard round the world.
Exactly.
But here's the thing. Winning independence, that's one thing. But how do you build a country that actually protects those freedoms? That's a whole other challenge.
Huge challenge. That's when the real work began for the Founding Fathers, trying to balance a strong government with individual rights and states' rights. Talk about walking a tightrope.
Okay, yeah, let's get into that a bit. Our sources point to the Second Amendment as a big piece of that puzzle. On the surface, it seems pretty simple. But all the debate around it today really shows how complicated it is. That whole relationship between the Second Amendment and liberty and this idea of a fail-safe against tyranny.
Yeah, absolutely. And to really understand it, you got to think about the historical context. Back then, firearms, essential for survival, basically. Out on the frontier, you needed a gun. Protection from animals, hostile tribes.
Criminals even.
Exactly. So gun ownership, it wasn't just about rights, it was about practical safety, carving out a life in a pretty wild, untamed place.
Easy to forget how different things were then. But here's something interesting. Our sources suggest that the Second Amendment, it didn't really become a big point of disagreement until after the Civil War. Kind of counterintuitive, isn't it?
It might seem that way, but, think about what was happening then. After the Civil War, you had groups like the Ku Klux Klan rising up, using violence, intimidation.
To maintain white supremacy.
Right, and Lincoln's assassination, that really shook people, showed how individuals with guns could disrupt the government itself.
Wow. So the Second Amendment gets pulled into all these huge issues. Racial equality, the limits of federal power.
Exactly. We're not talking about frontier survival anymore. This is a whole different ballgame.
Totally. And we actually have a key case from this era, United States versus Cruikshank. It came out of the Colfax Massacre in 1873. Horrific event.
Yeah.
A white supremacist militia killed over 150 African Americans.
It's a turning point, really, and the court's ruling.
It revealed so much about how intertwined these things are. The right to bear arms, liberty, and the potential for tyranny.
And not just tyranny from the government, but from within society, too.
This Cruikshank case really shows the double-edged nature of the Second Amendment, meant to protect against tyranny, but also used to justify violence and suppress freedom. What a paradox.
Yeah, a real paradox. And it's at the heart of the challenges we face today. How to apply the Second Amendment in a way that really upholds liberty for everyone. especially in the modern world with the whole debate around gun control.
All right, let's fast forward to the present then. Gun control. Man, that's one topic that could get people fired up.
Yeah.
And our sources show just how divided things are. It's like each side is saying, we're the real champions of liberty.
That's the core issue, isn't it? Is having easy access to guns actually a threat to freedom? Or is it the other way around? Is gun control itself a form of tyranny?
Because then you're taking away people's right to defend themselves.
Exactly, leaving them vulnerable. So it's like everyone agrees freedom is essential, but they have completely different ideas about how to protect it.
And with the way information is today, constant overload, it's hard to figure out what to believe, what's really at stake.
It's true. You see that a lot in our sources, this idea that it's hard to even have a rational conversation about guns and liberty. Too much information. People just retreat to their own corners,
Echo chambers. Everyone's just reinforcing what they already believe.
Exactly. No real dialogue. So you have one side arguing that gun control is essential to prevent mass shootings, keep people safe. They see that as protecting the right to life.
And the other side is just as passionate, saying that the right to bear arms, it's essential for self-defense against criminals.
Yeah.
And the government, if it ever overreaches.
Like, that's the ultimate safeguard against tyranny, the last line of defense.
But this isn't just an abstract debate. We're talking about real people, real fears, and real tragedies on both sides. It's emotionally charged for a reason.
Absolutely. And to really make sense of it, we need to go beyond the slogans, understand the history, the arguments on each side, and the forces at play here.
Yeah, speaking of forces.
Yeah.
We can't ignore the gun industry here, especially groups like the NRA. They've been shaping this conversation for decades.
No doubt about it. They've been incredibly successful in making gun ownership part of American identity, tied to self-reliance, individual freedom, that whole frontier spirit.
We've got some of Wayne LaPierre's editorials in our sources.
Yeah.
He's been the face of the NRA for years. And his message is pretty clear. Restricting gun rights is attacking the Constitution, attacking the will of the people.
Yeah, and he doesn't hold back. He calls gun control advocates anti-democratic. It's a powerful argument, taps into those core beliefs about freedom, self-determination.
But it does make you wonder, how much of this is about protecting liberty for everyone?
Right. Tough question to answer. And it seems like we need to understand both the legal side and the cultural side of this to really grasp what the Second Amendment means, especially in relation to liberty.
Absolutely. So let's step into the courtroom, see how the Second Amendment has been interpreted by the highest court in the land. What do you say?
Let's do it.
All right. Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into something today that you might think the Second Amendment, but there's a lot more to it than meets the eye.
Oh, absolutely. It's true. We hear the 27 words quoted all the time, but we rarely dive into all the historical context and the legal interpretations and all that.
Exactly. And we've got some great sources lined up today to really help us understand not just what it says, but the why behind it. We've got historical documents, court cases, and even some more recent analysis. So
that's key.
Yeah.
Without that context, it's easy to misunderstand.
All right. So let's get started with the amendment itself. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed.
Yeah.
A lot to unpack there.
Absolutely. And the language itself has been debated like crazy, but to get its meaning, we need to go back to the late 18th century, the founding of the United States.
Yeah. So imagine a newly independent nation. They just fought a war to win their freedom from British rule.
Right.
And they're wary of centralized power.
Exactly.
Okay.
The founding fathers were very skeptical of standing armies.
Okay.
They thought they could become tools of tyranny.
One of our sources highlights that at the time there was a real fear that a powerful federal government with a standing army could just, eventually suppress individual liberties.
And to counter that, they included the Second Amendment to make sure people could be armed.
Yeah.
And if necessary, form militias to protect themselves and their communities.
It's fascinating, how different the world was back then. Another source kind of paints a picture of early America. Families relied on hunting for survival. There were threats from wild animals and hostile groups. Self-defense was a daily reality.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah.
So the Second Amendment comes from this unique combination of factors, a deep distrust of government overreach, and a very real need for security. personal and collective security.
Yeah, it's like a two-pronged defense mechanism that's built into the fabric of the country.
It is. It's a fascinating look into the priorities and the anxieties of that era.
Now, I think it's important to point out from the beginning there were different interpretations of what the Second Amendment meant in practice.
Oh, yeah. Right.
Right away, there were disagreements about whether it was mostly about states being able to maintain militias or if it also meant an individual right to bear arms for personal use.
Right. And that debate continues to this day.
It sure does. And to really understand how that debate has changed, we need to look at how it's been interpreted by the courts.
Let's do that. One case that stands out is United States v. Cruikshank from 1876.
Okay.
Even though it's not as well known
Right.
as some of the later rulings, this one's pivotal.
Yeah. And the historical context of it is disturbing.
Oh, for sure.
It stems from the Colfax Massacre in 1873.
Where a white supremacist militia in Louisiana attacked black citizens protecting a courthouse.
Over 100 black people were murdered. One of the deadliest incidents of racial violence during Reconstruction. Just horrific.
A horrific event.
Yeah.
And what makes Cruikshank so important is that it was the first Supreme Court case to directly look at the scope of the Second Amendment.
Okay, so what was the court's ruling and why was it so impactful?
Well, they basically said the Second Amendment only restricted the federal government from infringing on the right to bear arms.
Okay.
It didn't apply to state governments.
So meaning that states had a lot more leeway to enact their own gun control measures.
You got it. The Cruikshank decision created a two-tiered system where federal power was limited, but states had more authority.
And this really had major consequences for gun control legislation, especially in the South.
Oh, it did. Cruikshank basically gave southern states a legal basis to implement restrictive gun laws. And a lot of times those were aimed at disarming black citizens and reinforcing white supremacy.
Yeah, it's a stark reminder of how these legal interpretations can have far-reaching social and political consequences.
It is, absolutely.
Right.
And the Cruikshank ruling kind of set the stage for almost a century
Right.
of limited federal involvement in gun control.
Right.
States were pretty much in charge.
Yeah, but as we move through the 20th century, we start to see a gradual shift in that balance. The federal government starting to take a more active role.
That's right.
Right.
And a lot of times this shift is driven by major events, by things that happen that cause public outcry and calls for action.
Right. One of those events was the wave of gangster violence during Prohibition in the 1920s and 30s.
Right. All that use of firearms by organized crime, that led to the National Firearms Act of 1934, which, imposed taxes and registration requirements on some weapons,
Right.
like machine guns and sawed-off shotguns.
So this marked a turning point. The federal government steps in to regulate firearms more directly.
Yeah, for sure. It targeted specific types of weapons associated with criminal activity,
Right.
but it was still a pretty big move away from the limited federal role we
Right.
saw with Cruikshank.
Exactly. Okay. And then the 1960s, super tumultuous decade.
Yeah.
You have the assassinations of, President Kennedy, Martin Luther King Jr., Robert F. Kennedy. Gun violence is thrust back into the national spotlight.
Right. These tragic events created this sense of urgency, and it led to the Gun Control Act of 1968, which, broadened the categories of people who couldn't own firearms.
Right.
Felons, people with mental health conditions, folks dishonorably discharged from the military, things like that.
So that seems like a pretty major expansion.
It was.
Of federal authority over gun ownership.
Oh, yeah, it was. The Gun Control Act also created a system for licensing gun dealers
Okay.
and stopped interstate sales of firearms.
Wow.
So it strengthened federal oversight even more.
It's interesting to see how public sentiment, in these specific events
Right.
have shaped the trajectory of gun control legislation.
It is. It's the pattern, that we see again and again. Like, take the attempted assassination of President Reagan in 1981.
Right.
That led to the Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act in 1993.
Right, which instituted the waiting periods and background checks for gun purchases.
Exactly. A really key part
Yeah.
of federal gun control, even today.
It's a really significant piece of legislation that's had, definitely had an impact, but it's also been met with opposition from gun rights groups who see it as, an infringement on the Second Amendment.
For sure.
Right.
For sure.
Which brings us to the ongoing debate, over the individual versus collective rights interpretation of the Second Amendment.
Yeah.
This debate's been raging for centuries.
Yeah.
But in 2008, it took a dramatic turn with District of Columbia v. Heller, a landmark Supreme Court case.
Heller was a real watershed moment, I think, for Second Amendment law. It's still shaping the legal landscape around gun ownership.
Yeah, for those who might not be as familiar with the case, can you give us a little overview of what was at stake and what the court decided?
Sure. The case was all about this Washington, D.C. law that basically banned handguns in the city.
Okay.
Dick Heller, a special police officer, challenged the law.
Right.
He said it violated his Second Amendment right to have a gun at home for self-defense.
So this was a direct challenge to that long-held belief that the Second Amendment was mostly about the right to bear arms as part of a militia.
Exactly. And in a 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court struck down that D.C. law.
Wow.
They ruled that the Second Amendment protects an individual's right to have a gun.
Okay.
Not connected to a militia or anything.
Yeah.
And to use it for lawful purposes, like self-defense at home.
So this was a huge win for gun rights advocates.
Absolutely.
Right. It affirmed this individual right to bear arms.
It did. It marked a big change from earlier interpretations.
Right.
And it's had a huge impact on gun control laws all over the country.
Yeah, and it's also reignited the debate, over what limitations, if any, could be placed on this individual right to bear arms.
For sure. The Heller ruling didn't answer all the questions, you know?
Right.
Like, what gun control measures are actually allowed?
Right.
That's still up for debate.
Yeah.
Big time.
And those questions continue to be, debated in courts and legislatures all over the country.
All the time. The Heller decision was huge, but it didn't give us, a perfect roadmap for how to deal with gun rights and gun control in the 21st century.
It's a conversation that continues to evolve, shaped by these historical precedents and legal interpretations.
Right.
And, just societal anxieties surrounding gun violence. Yep. It feels like, we've only just scratched the surface here.
We really have. The Second Amendment it's more than just a sentence. It's a reflection of our history, our values, our struggles.
Right.
With balancing individual freedom and safety.
And as we've seen, it's been interpreted in different ways over time. Shaped by court rulings and laws and just, how society changes.
Right. It's a dynamic conversation.
Yeah.
We have to grapple with these tough questions about the role of firearms in our world today, about the limits on government and the meaning of freedom. It's a lot.
It is. Given all that we've talked about, what do you think are some of the most important things for our listeners to take away from this? What do they keep in mind as they, kind of navigate this issue?
I think it's really important to understand the history, the context. What were the founding fathers worried about? What was the need for self-defense back then?
Right.
That helps us understand the principles behind the amendment.
It's not just about guns. It's about, it's about power and security and this balance between individual rights and the common good.
Absolutely. And it's also really important, I think, to understand how complicated the legal side of this is.
Yeah.
We've seen the courts change their interpretations over time from that narrow view of Cruikshank to that broader view of individual rights in Heller.
Right. And those interpretations are still being challenged and refined today.
Oh, yeah. All the time.
And that's shaping gun control laws. Something that's really struck me is this theme that keeps coming up. How big events in society drive change in gun control laws.
Yeah.
Right. Whether it's the gangster violence during Prohibition or the assassinations in the 60s or these mass shootings that have become, unfortunately, way too common. It seems like these times of crisis, they really push for action. They push for new laws.
They do.
How do we navigate this, this really complex issue and find some common ground in a debate that feels so divided?
I think it comes down to, having open and honest conversations, really trying to understand where other people are coming from and being willing to consider solutions that address the root causes of violence, but also, protect those constitutional rights.
Right. It's tough, but it's a conversation that we need to have.
Absolutely. We can't avoid it.
Right.
It's too important.
Yeah.
It's about what it means to be an American
Yeah.
in the 21st century.
This deep dive has been really thought-provoking.
It has.
And I want to encourage our listeners to keep exploring these issues. Read the sources we mentioned, talk about it with each other, challenge your own beliefs.
Yeah, the more we learn, the better we can participate in this
Yeah.
crucial conversation
Right.
and hopefully find some real solutions.
Thanks for joining us, everybody. And until next time, keep digging deeper.
Hey folks, thanks for tuning in to Deep Dive Dispatch. We hope you found today's episode enlightening and packed full of insight. Remember, your support keeps us diving deep into the stories that matter. So if you enjoyed the show, make sure to download and share it with others who crave a deeper understanding of politics and history. And don't forget, we want to hear from you. If there's a topic out there that you think deserves a deep dive, reach out and let us know. Your input helps us bring you the most compelling content week after week. Stay curious, stay informed, and we'll catch you next time on Deep Dive Dispatch. Keep exploring, folks.